GK. And I'm the guy they're after, 100%.
For him to die, I wish for him to have a long, suffering, cruel death.
The top 10 most satisfying arrests in true crime history, or cold-blooded criminals ran out of time and justice slammed the door shut.
Case number 10, the Cleveland captivity monster, Ariel Castro. The 911 call came in at 5:52 p.m. on May 6, 2013.
Cleveland 911, you need...
Hello, police. Help me, I'm Amanda Berry.
You need police, fire, or ambulance.
I need police.
Okay, and what's going on there?
I've been kidnapped and I've been missing for 10 years and I'm here, I'm free now.
Help me, I'm Amanda Berry, the voice cried through the phone. I've been kidnapped and I've been missing for 10 years. On the other end of that call was a woman the world thought was dead. And in that moment, one of the most twisted criminal empires in American history began to crumble. For over a decade, Ariel Castro had been Cleveland's perfect neighbor. He drove a school bus. He played bass guitar at local gatherings. He smiled and waved at children. But behind the boarded windows of his modest home on Seymour Avenue, Castro was operating a house of unspeakable horrors. Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, and Michelle Knight, three young women who had vanished from Cleveland streets between 2002 and 2004. The city had mourned them. Their families had never stopped searching. And all along, they were chained in Castro's basement, enduring daily torture, rape, and psychological manipulation that would break most human beings. Castro was a master manipulator. He attended vigils for his victims. He helped search for Gina DeJesus, knowing full well she was locked in his basement. He looked Amanda Berry's mother in the eye at community meetings, offering his condolences while her daughter suffered just miles away. For 11 years, he played the role of concerned citizen, while secretly being one of the most depraved criminals in modern history. But on that Monday afternoon in May, Castro made his first mistake in over a decade. He left the house without properly securing Amanda Berry's door. She heard a neighbor, Charles Ramsey, outside and screamed for help. Ramsey kicked down the door and Amanda Berry stepped into the sunlight for the first time in 10 years. Within hours, Cleveland police had surrounded Castro's house. When they arrested him at a nearby McDonald's, Castro seemed almost relieved. The weight of maintaining his double life for over a decade had finally become too much to bear. As the handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists, this monster who had stolen 3 lives simply said, "I knew this day would come." The satisfaction wasn't just in seeing Castro arrested. It was in watching 3 women who had been declared dead walk out of that house alive. Ariel Castro was sentenced to life plus 1,000 years in prison. He died by suicide in his cell just 1 month later, ensuring he'd never hurt another soul. But if you thought seeing a decade-long predator finally caught was satisfying, wait until you see what happens when technology becomes the hunter's worst enemy.
Case number 9, the BTK killer's digital downfall, Dennis Rader. The letter arrived at Cake TV in Wichita, Kansas on February 16, 2005. Inside was a floppy disk and a note that would end one of the longest-running serial killer cases in American history. The BTK killer, who had terrorized Kansas for over 30 years, had just made the fatal mistake that would lead police straight to his door.
GK. And I'm the guy they're after, 100%.
Between 1974 and 1991, Dennis Rader had murdered 10 people in and around Wichita. He called himself BTK, bind, torture, kill, and he took sadistic pleasure in taunting police with letters describing his crimes in graphic detail. He would break into homes, tie up entire families, and methodically murder them while taking photographs as souvenirs. What made Rader particularly terrifying wasn't just his brutality, it was his invisibility. By day, he was a compliance officer, a church council president, a Boy Scout leader. He was married with children. Neighbors described him as helpful, if a bit odd. For 17 years after his last known murder, Rader simply vanished, leaving investigators with cold cases and families no closure. But Rader's ego was bigger than his caution. In 2004, 30 years after his first murder, he began communicating with police again. He sent letters, packages, and clues, always staying one step ahead. He was playing a game, and he believed he was winning. His fatal error came when he asked police a simple question in a letter. "Can you trace information from a floppy disk?" Detective Randy Stone replied through a newspaper ad telling BTK that floppy disks could not be traced. It was a lie. When Rader's next package arrived, containing a floppy disk, investigators discovered metadata that led them straight to Christ Lutheran Church and a user named Dennis. On February 25, 2005, police followed Dennis Rader's daughter to get a DNA sample from a discarded pap smear. It was a perfect match to evidence from the crime scenes. The net was closing, and Rader had no idea. The arrest came on February 25, 2005. Rader was pulled over in his white Jeep Cherokee just blocks from his home. When Wichita Police Detective Kelly Otis approached his window and asked him to step out of the vehicle, Rader knew immediately why they were there. As the handcuffs clicked shut, this man who had terrorized the city for 30 days looked up at Detective Otis and said, "I guess it's time." The most satisfying part wasn't just catching BTK, it was watching him realize that his own arrogance had destroyed him. Dennis Rader is now serving 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, and his name will forever be synonymous with the monster he truly was. But sometimes, the most satisfying arrests come not from high-tech investigations, but from old-fashioned detective work and a criminal's inability to stay quiet. Case number 8. The methodical monster's final mistake. Israel Keyes. The ransom photo was supposed to be proof of life. Instead, it became evidence of death. On February 1, 2012, 18-year-old Samantha Koenig disappeared from the Anchorage coffee kiosk where she worked. What her family didn't know was that she was already dead, and the man demanding ransom had staged an elaborate deception using her corpse. Israel Keyes was perhaps the most methodical serial killer in modern American history. Unlike most killers who had patterns or preferred victim types, Keyes was completely random. He would fly to distant cities, rent cars with cash, and hunt for victims he had never seen before. He buried kill kits across the country, weapons, zip ties, and cash hidden in remote locations, waiting for his return. For over a decade, Keyes had been killing across America, and authorities didn't even know he existed. He had no criminal record, no pattern, no signature. He was the perfect predator, and he knew it. What made him even more terrifying was his intelligence. He was a skilled carpenter, a devoted father, and by all accounts, a functional member of society. But Israel Keyes made one crucial mistake. He killed someone in his own backyard. When he abducted Samantha Koenig from her coffee stand, he broke his own rules. And when he used her debit card in Texas weeks later, he handed investigators their first real clue. FBI agents traced the debit card usage and began following Keyes across the country. What they discovered was a killer unlike any they had ever encountered. In hotel rooms and rental cars, they found kill kits and evidence linking him to murders across multiple states. The methodical monster who thought he was untouchable had finally made enough mistakes to create a trail. On March 13, 2012, FBI agents arrested Israel Keyes at a traffic stop in Lufkin, Texas. When they pulled him over, Keyes immediately knew his killing spree was over. As the handcuffs snapped shut, agents could see something they had never seen before in his eyes: fear. For the first time in his adult life, Israel Keyes wasn't in control. The most satisfying part of this arrest was watching a killer who believed he was smarter than everyone else realize that his perfect system had failed him. During interrogations, Keyes admitted to multiple murders across the country, but before he could reveal the full extent of his crimes, he died by suicide in his jail cell. While we may never know the true number of Israel Keyes' victims, seeing this methodical monster in handcuffs reminded us that even the most careful predators eventually slip up. But sometimes, satisfaction comes not from catching a killer, but from catching a killer who thought fame would protect him. Case number 7. Phil Spector, the fallen music legend. The mansion was silent, except for the sound of sirens cutting through the Hollywood hills. It was February 3, 2003, and inside the Alhambra castle that music legend Phil Spector called home, actress Lana Clarkson lay dead with a gunshot wound to her mouth. When police arrived, they found Spector's chauffeur standing in the driveway, visibly shaken. "I think my boss killed somebody," he told officers.
Phil Spector was rock royalty. He had created the wall of sound that defined 1960s pop music. He had worked with the Beatles, the Ronettes, and countless other legends. His net worth was estimated at over $30 million, and his influence on music was immeasurable. But behind the genius was a man with a history of violence, intimidation, and pulling guns on women. For decades, Spector had used his fame and fortune as a shield. Multiple women had come forward over the years describing incidents where Spector had threatened them with firearms, held them hostage in his mansion, and subjected them to psychological torture. But his lawyers were expensive, his connections were powerful, and his victims were often dismissed as attention seekers or gold diggers. When 40-year-old actress Lana Clarkson met Spector at the House of Blues on February 2, 2003, she was simply looking for work. Clarkson had appeared in several B-movies and was struggling to find steady acting jobs. Spector invited her back to his mansion for drinks, and she accepted, seeing it as a potential networking opportunity. What happened next became the subject of one of the most high-profile murder trials in Hollywood history. Spector claimed Clarkson had committed suicide, but the evidence told a different story. Blood spatter analysis, witness testimony, and Spector's own history of violence painted a picture of a man who had finally gone too far. The arrest came swiftly. On March 31, 2009, after a lengthy trial that captivated the entertainment world, Phil Spector was found guilty of second-degree murder. As the verdict was read, this man who had spent decades believing his fame made him untouchable sat in stunned silence. When the bailiff approached with handcuffs, Spector looked around the courtroom as if searching for someone to save him. No one came. The most satisfying aspect of Spector's arrest and conviction was watching a man who had terrorized women for decades finally face consequences. His wealth, his fame, and his connections couldn't save him from justice. Phil Spector died in prison in 2021, serving a sentence of 19 years to life. But if you think watching a music legend fall from grace was satisfying, wait until you see what happens when a killer's own family helps bring him down.
Case number 6, Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer. The suburban house in Citrus Heights, California, looked perfectly ordinary. Manicured lawn, quiet street, the kind of place where nothing exciting ever happened. But on April 24, 2018, that ordinary house became the center of one of the most extraordinary arrests in criminal history. After more than 40 years, the Golden State Killer was finally gonna pay for his crimes. Between 1974 and 1986, a masked intruder terrorized California with a crime spree that seemed impossible to stop. He started as the Visalia ransacker, breaking into homes and stealing small items. Then he became the East Area rapist, attacking women in Sacramento with a methodical precision that terrified an entire region. Finally, he evolved into the original Night Stalker, adding murder to his repertoire of horrors. Joseph James DeAngelo was a master of psychological warfare. He would call victims before attacking, whispering threats in a childlike voice that haunted their nightmares for decades. He would break into homes days before his attacks, learning layouts and hiding supplies. During assaults, he would place dishes on male victims' backs, threatening to kill everyone if he heard them fall. What made DeAngelo particularly infuriating to law enforcement was his ability to vanish completely. Despite attacking over 50 women and murdering at least 13 people, he left virtually no usable evidence. For decades, he was a ghost, a monster who existed in case files and victims' nightmares, but never in handcuffs. The breakthrough came through revolutionary genetic genealogy techniques. In 2018, investigators uploaded the killer's DNA profile to GED Match, a public genealogy database. They found distant relatives, built family trees, and slowly narrowed down potential suspects. The trail led them to Joseph James DeAngelo, a 72-year-old former police officer living quietly in suburban Sacramento. On April 24, 2018, surveillance teams watched as DeAngelo threw away tissues while shopping at a Hobby Lobby store. Crime lab technicians extracted DNA from those tissues, and it was a perfect match. After 44 years, they had their monster. The arrest was swift and shocking. Sacramento County Sheriff's deputies surrounded D'Angelo's house at dawn. When they called for him to come out, neighbors watched in disbelief as this elderly man emerged in his pajamas, looking confused and frail. As the handcuffs clicked shut around the wrists that had terrorized California for over a decade, D'Angelo seemed genuinely surprised that his past had finally caught up with him. The most satisfying part wasn't just catching one of America's most prolific serial killers. It was giving closure to hundreds of victims and their families who had waited decades for justice. Joseph James D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 murders and numerous other charges. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring this monster would never hurt another soul. But sometimes the most satisfying arrests come from criminals who are so arrogant they practically arrest themselves.
Case number 5. Anthony Weiner, the politician who couldn't stop. The laptop screen glowed in the darkness of the FBI field office. It was September of 2016, and federal agents were examining a computer that would not only destroy a political career, but potentially change the course of American history. Anthony Weiner, the former congressman who had already fallen from grace multiple times, was about to discover that some mistakes you can never come back from. Anthony Weiner had once been the golden boy of New York politics. Charismatic, ambitious, and married to Huma Abedin, one of Hillary Clinton's closest advisors, Weiner seemed destined for greatness. He was a rising star in the Democratic Party, a congressman with national name recognition and unlimited potential. But Weiner had a secret addiction that would destroy everything he had worked for: sexting. In 2011, he was forced to resign from Congress after accidentally posting explicit photos on his public Twitter account. In 2013, his mayoral campaign imploded when more sexting scandals emerged. Each time he promised he had changed. Each time he was lying. What made Weiner's behavior particularly despicable was his complete inability to learn from his mistakes. Even after his career was destroyed, even after his marriage was hanging by a thread, he continued sending explicit messages to women online. His arrogance was breathtaking. He genuinely believed he was too smart to get caught again. The final straw came in 2016 when investigators discovered that Weiner had been sexting with a 15-year-old girl from North Carolina. This wasn't just political suicide, it was a federal crime. The FBI launched an investigation, and what they found on Weiner's devices would send shockwaves through the highest levels of government. On September 26, 2016, FBI agents executed a search warrant at Weiner's Manhattan apartment. When they arrested him, Weiner seemed almost relieved that his double life was finally over. As the handcuffs clicked shut, this man who had once been considered a future mayor, governor, or even president was reduced to just another sex offender in federal custody. The most satisfying part of Weiner's downfall was watching someone who believed he was untouchable learn that actions have consequences. His sexting addiction didn't just destroy his own life, it potentially influenced a presidential election when FBI Director James Comey announced they were reviewing emails found on Weiner's laptop just days before the vote. Anthony Weiner served 21 months in federal prison and is now a registered sex offender. His political career is over, his marriage is over, and his reputation is permanently destroyed. Sometimes the most satisfying arrests are the ones where criminals arrest themselves through their own stupidity and arrogance. But if you think a politician's fall from grace was satisfying, wait until you see what happens when a killer makes the mistake of trying to become famous.
Case number 4, Rodney Ocala, the dating game killer. The television studio audience applauded as the handsome bachelor walked onto the stage of the dating game. It was September 13, 1978, and Rodney Ocala charmed viewers with his wit and good looks. What they didn't know was that they were watching one of America's most prolific serial killers on primetime television, a monster who used his appearances on TV to hunt for victims. Rodney Ocala was the perfect predator. Intelligent, charismatic, and devastatingly handsome, he could convince almost anyone to trust him. He was also a skilled photographer, which gave him the perfect excuse to approach young women and children. Between 1968 and 1979, Ocala murdered at least 7 people, though investigators believe the real number could be much higher. What made Ocala particularly dangerous was his intelligence and planning. He would research his victims, learn their routines, and strike when they were most vulnerable. He took photographs of his victims both before and after killing them, creating a horrific collection that he kept as trophies. His crimes were so brutal that even seasoned homicide detectives were shocked by the evidence. Ocala's arrogance was his ultimate downfall. Not content with simply killing, he craved attention and recognition. His appearance on the dating game was just the beginning. He began taking unnecessary risks, keeping victims' belongings as souvenirs, and even contacting police to taunt them about unsolved cases. The breakthrough came in 1979 when Robin Samso disappeared while riding her bike to ballet class in Huntington Beach, California. Witnesses described seeing her talking to a man with a camera who was asking for directions. When her body was discovered, investigators found enough evidence to link Ocala to the crime. On July 24, 1979, Rodney Ocala was arrested at his mother's house in Monterey Park, California. When police surrounded the residence, Ocala tried to maintain his charming facade, right up until the handcuffs clicked shut. There must be some mistake, he told officers with a smile that had once fooled millions of television viewers. The most satisfying part of Ocala's arrest was discovering the massive collection of evidence in his possession. Police found hundreds of photographs of unidentified women and children, jewelry belonging to victims, and detailed records of his crimes. This man, who had thought he was too clever to catch, had essentially documented his own guilt. Rodney Ocala was convicted and sentenced to death multiple times. He died on California's death row in 2021, taking the secrets of his other victims with him to the grave. But his arrest gave closure to the families who had waited years for justice, and ensured that this charming monster would never hurt another soul. Sometimes the most satisfying arrests come when killers get too comfortable and forget that someone is always watching.
Case number 3. Scott Peterson, The Perfect Husband Act. The Berkeley Marina was bustling with Christmas Eve shoppers, but Scott Peterson wasn't there to buy presents. On December 24, 2002, Peterson launched his small boat into San Francisco Bay, claiming he was going fishing for sturgeon. 4 months later, when the bodies of his pregnant wife Lacey and their unborn son Connor washed ashore in that same bay, investigators knew they had found their killer. Scott Peterson was America's picture-perfect husband. Handsome, successful, and seemingly devoted to his pregnant wife, Peterson played the role of grieving husband flawlessly when Lacey disappeared on Christmas Eve 2002. He gave tearful interviews, organized search parties, and begged for his wife's safe return. The entire nation was captivated by the young couple's story and prayed for Lacey's safe return. But behind Peterson's perfect facade was a man living a double life. While his wife was 8 months pregnant with their first child, Peterson was having an affair with massage therapist Amber Frey. He had told Frey that he was single and had even claimed to be traveling in Europe during the holidays when he was actually murdering his wife. What made Peterson particularly despicable was his calculated manipulation of everyone around him. He continued the charade for months, knowing exactly where Lacey's body was while watching her family suffer through the agony of not knowing. He attended vigils, spoke at press conferences, and even helped hang missing person flyers, all while knowing his wife was dead at the bottom of San Francisco Bay. The investigation began to focus on Peterson when inconsistencies in his story emerged. It's claimed that he was fishing for sturgeon in December when sturgeon season was closed raised immediate red flags. When police discovered his affair with Amber Frey, she agreed to cooperate with investigators and began recording their conversations. On April 18, 2003, Scott Peterson was arrested at a golf course in La Jolla, California. When police approached him, this man who had spent months playing the grieving husband finally dropped his act and remained silent. The most satisfying part of Peterson's arrest was watching his perfect husband facade crumble under the weight of evidence.
The man who had looked America in the eye and lied about murdering his pregnant wife was finally going to face justice. Recorded phone calls with Amber Frey revealed Peterson's true personality: cold, calculating, and completely devoid of remorse. Scott Peterson was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, though his sentence was later commuted to life in prison without parole. His arrest gave closure to Lacey's family and reminded the world that monsters often hide behind the most charming smiles. But if you think watching a fake grieving husband get arrested was satisfying, wait until you see what happens when technology catches a killer who thought he had committed the perfect crime.
Case number 2. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer.
You're a loser, you're a coward, you're a nobody, you're an animal.
For him to die, I wish for him to have a long, suffering, cruel death.
The saliva sample was less than a teaspoon, but it contained enough DNA to solve one of the longest-running serial killer cases in American history. On November 30th, 2001, Gary Ridgway was painting trucks at Kenworth Motors when detectives arrived with an arrest warrant. The man who had terrorized the Pacific Northwest for 2 decades, killing at least 49 women, was about to learn that time and technology had finally caught up with him. For over 20 years, Gary Ridgway had been the boogeyman of Seattle. Between 1982 and 1984, young women, mostly prostitutes and runaways, began disappearing from the SeaTac Strip at an alarming rate. Their bodies were found dumped along the Green River and in wooded areas throughout King County. The killer seemed to know exactly how to avoid detection, and investigators were always one step behind. What made Ridgway particularly terrifying was his ability to blend into society. He was married, held steady jobs, and appeared to be just another blue-collar worker trying to make a living. Neighbors described him as quiet and helpful. Coworkers said he was reliable and hardworking. No one suspected that this unassuming man was responsible for one of the largest murder sprees in American history. Ridgway was also incredibly intelligent about avoiding capture. He would take victims' jewelry and clothing to confuse investigators about timelines. He would return to dump sites to move bodies and destroy evidence. He even attended victims' funerals and inserted himself into the investigation by contacting police with fake tips about other suspects. The breakthrough came through advances in DNA technology. In 1987, investigators had collected evidence from several crime scenes, but the technology to analyze it properly didn't exist yet. By 2001, new DNA analysis techniques allowed investigators to create detailed profiles from microscopic samples. When they ran the profiles through their database of suspects, Gary Ridgway's name came up as a perfect match. The arrest was swift and decisive. On November 30th, 2001, King County detectives surrounded Ridgway at his workplace. When they showed him the arrest warrant, this man who had evaded capture for 2 decades simply nodded and said, "I always wondered when this day would come." As the handcuffs clicked shut, investigators knew they had finally caught one of America's most prolific serial killers. The most satisfying part of Ridgway's arrest was the closure it brought to dozens of families who'd waited decades for justice. During plea negotiations, Ridgway agreed to reveal the locations of additional victims' remains in exchange for life in prison instead of the death penalty. He confessed to 48 murders, though investigators believe he killed many more. Gary Ridgway is now serving 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. His arrest proved that no matter how much time passes, justice can still be served when investigators refuse to give up. But if you think catching America's most prolific serial killer was satisfying, our #1 case involves an arrest so shocking and satisfying that it captivated the entire world. Case number 1. O.J. Simpson, the chase that stopped America. The white Ford Bronco moved slowly down the 405 freeway, followed by a parade of police cars that stretched for miles. Inside the vehicle, former NFL superstar O.J. Simpson held a gun to his head, while his friend Al Cowlings pleaded with him not to pull the trigger. It was June 17, 1994, and 95 million Americans were watching live television coverage of the most surreal arrest in modern history. 5 days earlier, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman had been found brutally murdered outside Nicole's Brentwood condominium. The crime scene was horrific. Both victims had suffered multiple stab wounds and nearly been decapitated. Almost immediately, suspicion fell on O.J. Simpson, Nicole's ex-husband, who had a documented history of domestic violence against her.
Simpson was American royalty. The former Heisman Trophy winner had been one of the greatest running backs in NFL history before transitioning to a successful career in movies and television. He was charming, charismatic, and beloved by millions of fans who couldn't believe their hero could be capable of such brutality. But behind Simpson's public persona was a man consumed by jealousy and rage. His relationship with Nicole had been marked by years of physical and emotional abuse. Police had been called to their home multiple times for domestic violence incidents. Friends and family members described a pattern of controlling behavior that escalated after their divorce. The evidence against Simpson was overwhelming. His blood was found at the crime scene and in his Bronco. A trail of blood led from his vehicle to his front door. A bloody glove found at his Rockingham estate matched one found at the murder scene. DNA analysis would later show that the odds of the blood belonging to someone other than Simpson were billions to 1. When Simpson failed to surrender as scheduled on June 17, 1994, he became a fugitive from justice. The subsequent chase captivated the nation as millions of viewers watched this American icon's spectacular fall from grace play out in real time on their television screens. The arrest finally came at Simpson's Rockingham estate, where the Bronco chase ended after nearly 2 hours. When LAPD officers approached the vehicle, they found Simpson in the back seat, still holding the gun. As the handcuffs were placed on his wrists, this man, who had once been one of America's most beloved celebrities, was now just another suspect in a double murder case. What made Simpson's arrest so satisfying wasn't the chase itself. It was watching someone who believed he was above the law finally being held accountable. For years, Simpson had used his fame and fortune to escape consequences for his behavior. The arrest showed that even American icons aren't immune to justice. While Simpson was ultimately acquitted in the criminal trial, he was found liable for the wrongful death in civil court and ordered to pay $33.5 million in damages. Years later, he was sentenced to 33 years in prison for armed robbery and kidnapping in Las Vegas, though he was granted parole after serving 9 years. The O.J. Simpson arrest remains one of the most watched events in television history and a reminder that in America, no one is truly above the law.